Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Plan Team Call. And the first item we have today for the agenda is Excel demoing the Epic icons on issues. So, Excel, take it over.
Hello, guys. So I'm going to do two demos. I'm going to show two things that are closely related. So the first thing is a bit of dog fooding. Like this is the new issuable list made in Vue. It doesn't look that different, I know, but the one of the cool things is that we added this. Give me a second, sorry. One of the cool things is that we added the sub icon indicator, the sub epic indicator on each of the issues. And it turned out to be pretty easy compared to the Helm version, the pure Ruby version. So what happened to my server? Well, let's give it a minute. This is already working on production. This is only like the Vue implementation. And give me a second, let me restart. So yeah, while we're waiting, I wanted to show you like the second thing we work on this week. We have this ugly bug where you can see here that we are filtering issues by epics. So whenever we resubmitted the form, we are going to get an extra ampersand here. So this is on production. So if you give me a second for this to load, I'm going to show you the solution. Yeah, so sorry, I don't know why.
I think restart is going to take some time. So, John, you want to go through your points while Excel's environment is up?
Thank you.
Sure thing. I don't know whether to stretch this out a little bit to make it more likely that GDK is loaded on on the other end of it, but let's go anyway. So yeah, I thought I'd bring this to everyone's attention just because like the team have been really helpful in kind of breaking down the roadmaps page and trying to find ways that we can speed it up. And we're looking for kind of more suggestions around this, like especially things that we can deploy more generally to the rest of GitLab, basically. So I could do a quick demo. I know that not everybody on the call is going to be particularly interested in this, so I'll keep it really brief. But let me share my screen really quickly.
I'm super interested in it.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Gabe. Tell me if you can see the issue. Yeah?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so everything that we need to start off with is pretty much in this issue, but there are a couple of gotchas that I want to kind of just raise for anyone who might be interested in this and might want to look at it. So we run site speed analysis on a number of pages, and anyone can add new pages to be regularly checked against site speeds, kind of I don't know what you would call it, like profiling or something. The two ones that we're doing for roadmaps are a small roadmap page, which is the GitLab comps support page, which has, I don't know how many, like 12 epics against it. And also the GitLab org page, which has 750. So immediately, like off the top line, you can see a few things. The initial page load is nearly twice as slow, even though it's just an initial page load. So there may be some things there we could tune. But actually, I have these two pages open here. So this is the GitLab org one, and it would now be a race to see whether GDK starts up first or this page loads first. So generally, like if you're looking at the site speed statistics, I'd encourage everyone to just check the video on the site speed thing as well, and I'll show you why. So this is the waterfall chart for this page, specifically for GitLab org. You can see the initial page load for this particular measurement is nearly a second. You can also see that the GraphQL request goes on for quite a long time, but the really telling thing is that the last visual change is measured around 10 or 11 seconds, but you can see the GraphQL request takes quite a lot longer to respond. And you can see why that is. You just click the video tab, watch the video. Here's the page load as site speed sees it. There's your first visual change. Then you get the spinner and you kind of wait for the graph, for the roadmap to load. And then sometime around 11 seconds, it decides that the page has fully loaded because nothing else has happened. So if you actually check the charts for GitLab org, this can take up to 25 seconds, I think, to load the page, which is obviously problematic, because if you're waiting for 25 seconds for this to load on its initial load, how likely are you to use any of the other features we built around it, the filtering and so on? Probably quite unlikely. So so there are two ways I kind of look at this. The first one is we should look for, as Tim calls it in the general, like performance improvements across GitLab, low-hanging fruit. So things that we can fix quickly and more obvious things. And then we should also look for targeted things that we can do specifically to this page. And the way I see it is, like, if we are going for a targeted change, it should be like roughly one order of magnitude more effective than anything we could do that is more general. So to take the example of the initial page load, if we could shave, like, say 200 milliseconds off that, but we could generalize that across page loads across a wide array of endpoints on GitLab, that would be a very worthwhile change, in my opinion. On the other hand, if we can somehow solve n+1s or some GraphQL things that cause the top line number for GitLab org and other organizations with lots of epics to come down, that's also a worthwhile change. So yeah, you can check out that issue. There's quite a bit of discussion already on it, but of course I encourage more. Anyone can get involved, anyone can contribute. And yeah, like, if you see things on this page that, maybe think could be fixed, or even if you have kind of some suggestion to do with caching or something that we haven't thought of, please leave a message and start the discussion on that. Yeah, thanks.
I have a follow-up point to that. Like, I've noticed that in some cases, the way that we design features, like from the proc standpoint and the UX standpoint, lead to bad performance just because. And so how can we push, like, the discussion about performance left a little bit into the design phase almost? And to that end, milestones is equally slow as roadmaps. It takes about 30 to 45 seconds to fully render, like, one of our GitLab org milestones. And there's lots of reasons for that, I'm sure. But, like, as we are working on new designs for iterations, we're specifically trying to address some of the things and, like, make sure that we're designing in a way that when we backport it to milestones, it will help fix some of the performance issues. And I'm curious, like, if looking at the new designs, like, how can we understand, like, how to make those trade-offs up front when we're designing, instead of, like, forcing engineering into a bad position of fixing it after the fact?
Yeah, and we've made changes to the roadmap page when we switched it over, I believe, when we switched it over to GraphQL, and we did some measurements, and we found that, like, pound for pound, it was, roughly as performant as the previous REST endpoint, or it's more accurate to say that it was not performant, but not performant in different ways, right? So, like, if you had small numbers of epics, it was more performant, but if you had large numbers, it was less performant than the REST endpoint. And you're kind of stuck then in that position, like, do you stop the work and potentially hold up other improvements to that page? I mean, that's a tough question to ask. I think you have to take it on case-by-case basis. In this case, it was going to hold up a lot of work to the roadmaps. It was going to hold up any other progress, basically, because this was part of our plan to move to GraphQL and to do all features in GraphQL. But then there's two things, right? There's the perceived performance of a page and the actual measured performance, and they're both important, right? But if you look at the milestones page, the milestones page is slow because we load the issues column in the initial page load. We don't load any other column on that page in the initial page load. So a win would be to move that issues column to be asynchronous, and then the first visual change would be much, much faster. But it's not quite as simple as the merge requests request. It's quite a bit trickier, and we did do it at one point, and I think we rolled it back because it ended up breaking workflows. So it's a little trickier, but yeah, I mean, you could improve the perceived performance of the milestones page by doing that work.
What about combining, like, the issues into a single list and adding pagination with like infinite scroll kind of thing. Would that help?
It would help, yeah. It's because originally we set a limit on the issues, and that limit was, even though we felt it was quite high, turned out to be extremely low for some people. And not only was it too low for their list of issues, but it also ruined all their counts as well. So it just basically made the milestone page useless for them. It was unfortunate, but we can't, we just have to be cognizant of every use case whenever we kind of start this work, I guess.
And the other question I have around performance is are we rendering some of these calculations at runtime or when we query the data, or are we stashing any of it? Because things like counts, it's okay if we update that asynchronously in the background every 10 minutes or something, so you always had a static number that you could pull to the front end, so you didn't have to calculate it then. Have we thought about doing things like that to also improve performance for certain places where we show data that is derived and calculated on the fly?
Yeah, so these are the kind of suggestions that I'm really interested to hear, because there are some kind of gotchas around that as well, right? Because the issues that I can see and the issues that you can see may be different, and so the counts may be different. However, I'm sure there are cases where, it's specifically looking at the GitLab org roadmap, we're bringing in confidential epics, which means that yes, now there will be a problem caching the roadmap on the back end, because some people will be able to see some epics and other people won't. But in the past, we possibly could have cached maybe the entire list, and we just keep that cache warm, because you don't necessarily create epics nearly as much as you view them in a roadmap, so there might not have been a reason why we couldn't cache them. But I'm interested to hear, especially from people who've worked on this before, what the reasons are and aren't for caching this kind of stuff.
So I just wanted to add on the roadmap page performance improvements that we did a while ago. The first one that we did was that initially you must have noticed that when we used to load the roadmap page, it would show loading spinner while the request is finishing. And once request is finished, you would still see a blank page before you can actually see any rendered data. So that was clearly a front-end improvement that we were required to do. So we went on and did the buffer rendering on the page, where we would render only certain number of epics instead of rendering all of them at once. And that led to significant amount of improvements, like around 20 times improvements in just the rendering computations that were going on the front end. But yes, you already noticed, John, that GraphQL request is still taking quite a long time, and it is upwards of 20 seconds on every subsequent reload on the page. And we did compare that load duration with the Rails API, because we back then still had the code both on front end and back end to load epics on the roadmap using Rails. And it wasn't much difference there either. Now, when I look at roadmap loading performance, I believe request is taking longer, because right now I can see in the response that we are loading around 1300 epics within the response. So if the size of data that we are loading is massive, then it is obviously going to slow down the process. So there were a couple of things here. We could have improved this by using some sort of lazy loading, like Gabe mentioned, where user would scroll the list vertically, and we would insert new epics as user goes on. But we then hit a roadblock around the UX of how we are doing with horizontal timeline scrolling, where if user wishes to scroll on either direction, we would insert the epics at appropriate location based on the sort direction. So there were a couple of things that were going on the UX. Alexis is already aware of it. We discussed this at length, like how we can change the UX of horizontal infinite scrolling. Maybe if we can get rid of it, instead of scroll bar, we can maybe have some form of resizing the duration that we want to cover in the horizontal scrolling, so that once user resizes the scale, like how much they want to zoom out or zoom in into the timeline, we would load up the data, we would adhere to the sort direction that user is selected, but we would just not trigger any kind of requests on horizontal scrolling in either directions. So if we figure out a way to present the UX around how to do horizontal timeline scrolling instead of doing a scroll bar, then it solves two problems for us. We won't have to deal with sort direction, and we can still get on with the infinite scoring, where first GraphQL request that we will make would have page size defined to it, like we would load only 20 results at once. And once user scrolls further vertically into the list, we would pull in next page details. And that would free up backend from calculating all the number of epics that we are showing on UI, and we would load only that is visible on UI instead of all 1300 epics at once. Because as the number of epics for any group grows, this is going to be a problem in the long term. Second thing I wanted to include here was that, let me get back to the, yeah. So as I mentioned, while we were working on roadmap page performance improvements, I did look at the Periscope data, like because roadmap page has been slow for a while, but we didn't see any complaints, at least on developer side. Not sure if product managers had a chance to interact with customers and whether any customers complained about global roadmap page being slow when the number of epics are larger, but I didn't see any users complaining it. So that raised a question like whether users are actually looking at group level roadmaps or whether they are just using the roadmap tab that we have on individual epics. Because most of the times, ever since we have introduced nested epics, users can still see roadmap for a particular parent epic. And there they would only see only 5 or 6 epics at max, depending on how many child epics they have going. So if users are not using group level roadmap, then what does it make sense? Like, do we still want to continue presenting this UX, which gives you bird's eye of view, especially that we have nested groups in place where people kind of narrow down their scope into smaller groups with smaller number of epics instead of having a top level group?
Yeah, no, I can answer that. That's a great question. So, well, first off, roadmaps are one of the largest areas of opportunity that we have with enterprise level customers coming in to plan for portfolio management functionality. But the number of folks who are actually executing on them at the level that GitLab does is low. So I think one of the reasons we don't see complaints from the user sides or the group roadmaps is none of the customers using Plan right now at that level have 1,400 epics at their single group level. So I think there's some reality around how we have our work structured inside of GitLab, and we run into some unique problems. It's good to know that there's a limit, right? And we can tell customers, hey, if you get to 1,400, it's not going to work well. But for the most part, yeah, a lot of customers a lot of prospects and customers that we're starting to talk to, like I'm going to talk to, well, we're recording, I won't say, a big, large ultimate customer who's looking for a pretty large seat expansion today. They're excited about these possibilities, especially when we can get to the point where we can display like dependency mapping on this level. So one, it's an area where we have a lot of opportunity and we just haven't really been able to double down on it yet because we've been focusing on the epic level stuff. But yeah, it is an area that we need to invest in and continue to grow because there is a lot of interest, and it is an area that we will continue to lose customer interest in and prospect interest in against tools like AHA and Align because they do this pretty well.
I'd also say that we're early adopters for Plan. And so if we have problems at scale right now, our customers might not yet. But as we expand Plan into these organizations that are larger, they're going to run into the same problems and probably even more. Some of the folks that I've talked to have, upwards of 500,000 to 1 million issues. If you consider across, a team of 15,000 people, how many epics and issues they could end up creating. It gets pretty big. Now, they might not all roll up to the same top level group, but eventually we want reporting and all of these things to roll up to some high level place. So the aggregation and how we solve those problems, like technically is becoming increasingly important. So for what it's worth, a little context.
Yeah, and I think like we can increase the number of bytes by just trying to think of things that are going to be generalizable. I'll give you an example. So you might have seen this startup.js idea that has come out this week and has shaved like 20% loading time off page. I'll just quickly share again if I can. If you look at this waterfall chart for the GitLab org roadmap, you see that nothing happens until the initial page load and a couple of assets load, right? Nothing happens at all. But the idea behind startup.js is that you take this request for the actual useful data and you move it back here to the start, right? And you make that request asynchronously once you you load the page initially, but then before you kind of bootstrap the application, load all the assets. So you're not quite moving it right back to zero, but you're moving it back in the timeline. And so by the time the application has loaded enough to actually make the request around about here, you've already taken, you know, a second off the request time. The data is either available or it's or there's a promise available that it will be available that can be reused by the application. The problem with that is it currently only works with the REST API. It doesn't work with GraphQL yet, although I believe, I think Natalia is working on that. So yeah, it's just one example of how, like, it's a simple idea, but when it's generalized across the entire application, it will produce like measurable improvements in page load times across the entire application wherever it's used. And I think to actually employ this on a page, you simply have to change one line. So yeah, pretty cool. Those are the kind of big wins that we're looking for. And if we can like use the roadmap page as a test bed and then generalize it, all the better. But something that improves the loading of epics in GraphQL and reduces time significantly on this one page is still a win. But I think something that could be generalized is the real goal.
What does Start.js do again?
Okay, good question. So what it does is if your application, if your front end application makes a request for data to the back end, the front end application has to load, then it has to make the request. The idea behind Startup.js is that you make the request after the initial page load, just using like vanilla JavaScript. You load that into either a JSON object, which is provided to the front-end application, or if it's not ready yet, it provides the application with a wrapped promise, basically the same thing the application would use internally itself. So you're just basically moving the request into vanilla JavaScript. The reason it doesn't work with GraphQL yet is that it stores it against, the key is the URL that you've requested data for, and that's obviously quite complex with GraphQL because you have the query and then you have the variables, so it's harder to match one-to-one, but they're working on it.
And I'll add this to the issue if we're not doing it, but are we doing anything with service workers on the front end to store the JavaScript assets a little bit more and like cache them and make it so that you don't have to load fresh ones every time you go to a different view?
I don't know, Kushal, you might know.
So we did explore service workers, but we decided to keep only common bundle, which is applicable to all the pages, to keep in service worker. Obviously, it never moved past POC. Tim was working on it a while ago. I think it was more than a year ago when we started exploring that. It was only around the time when we introduced tree shaking within our Webpack config. So it would allow us to separate out the common bundle from page specific bundles. And then we decided to keep common bundle be part of service worker cache to reduce the load times. But I'm not sure if we are still moving in that direction. I'll follow up with Tim whether any other team working on the backstage of those changes. But yeah, that's a good idea. We can definitely look into that, especially for large application pages like roadmap requirements, which is also taking up the entire page of GitLab. So all the places where we have full page applications going, we can still utilize that. Axel, you have GDK up?
Hello again. So my server restarted. So yeah, basically the first thing I wanted to show you is this bit of dog fooding again, that we replicated this icon on issues that basically says that this issue is part of a Zug epic here on this epic. So so yeah, like the highlight here is that it was so easy to implement. It was pretty fun to work with because we have like the whole environment working with Vue now. So that's one of the things. And the other thing that I showed you is that, for example, here in production, we have this bug that whenever we resubmitted an epic filter, we're going to be adding ampersands to the ID. So this is solved. What we did there was basically update the tokenizer for this for the search query. So yeah, and regarding the conversation we had right now regarding performance, one of the an area on opportunity that I'm going to be looking into is this filter, because we could use some infinite loading here, because here it loads pretty quickly, but if we try to filter by epic here, then it is going to take a while. Like, like yeah. So yeah, that's it. I don't know if you have any question. No? Thank you.
Thanks, Axel. Moving on to workflow. So I've pasted link to weekly progress issue. Just in case you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or leave a comment in that issue if you want to alter the prioritization that we are doing for this week. Since Donald is on vacation for this week. Next is John.
Me again. Yeah, similar for the backend team. We have an async issue just to kick off. Purpose of these issues is to kind of draw attention to things that we have in progress, to provide a kind of start and end point for the milestone. So yeah, any feedback on the issue is appreciated. In particular, Mark and Keenan, if you would look at the deliverables section and see if you agree that I haven't missed anything. And yeah, we have some feedback on it already. I got feedback in the past that these were useful, so I'll keep doing them as long as they are. And once they stop being useful, I'll stop doing them. But the idea is just to try and get weights for everything, get things broken down, and to have a sense of team cohesion around some of the features that we deliver, so it doesn't just feel like a hamster wheel.
I'll probably try to steal this for project management as well. I think it would, at the very least, it would be very helpful for me. So I'm going to try to put it together, and hopefully it helps the team as well.
Yeah, I think it was Donald's idea originally. He started doing them for the front end team, and he said the same thing. Like, they were really helpful for him, and they're helpful for me. Like, I'm working on trying to automate some of these so we don't have to do them by hand every month, and we get them out faster. But until now, we have an issue template, I believe, that doesn't do much, just creates the headlines. You have to populate it yourself, but let's see, give me a bit of time and maybe we can collaborate on it, Jake.
That'd be great.
John, I'll say these are super helpful for me, so thank you.
Cool. I think I have the last item. So this is more of like a collaboration discussion on, I'd love feedback from engineers and UX folks, anyone who can help product, especially me, figure out like how to better support like getting more merge requests in per month while working on features, or just breaking things down to smaller pieces so it's easier to work in them in either parallel or in like smaller MRs behind a feature flag. And so like when I was working on iterations, I and writing out the epic, I made the assumption that if I like broke things down into like these like small very simple things, like, you know, click iterations list from a sidebar, or clicking a button to create an iteration, or, you know, like kind of vertical feature slices that the user would take on their journey to create it, that it would then be easy to like create a single MR that is front end back end for this given thing. And then you could like have a bunch of MRs or even a front end back end separate MR, whatever. But like this would, if we delivered this like in a release, this would like accomplish all the MR targets for the front end engineers and back end engineers. But as like things unfolded, and I'm going to talk to Simon and Mario about this. Mario's not here because they're the engineers who worked on this, to learn from them as well. But like, what's the best way to structure epics and issues in these like small chunks that are vertical feature slices, and like are things that you can tangibly test as an end user behind a feature flag as like a bigger feature is getting developed? Is there any feedback or suggestions from engineers on the best way to do that is most helpful for them?
I think from my perspective, and I obviously didn't work on it or didn't do code writing on it, but it's trickier. I think it's trickier with new things. So like iterations being largely a new MVC being developed as a new feature, like you're sort of starting from scratch, and at least my inclination is like do a whole bunch in one big chunk, and then when you're like continuing to iterate on stuff, it's easy to sort of find smaller pieces, but that could be part of it with regards to this specific example. There's also, I feel like different engineers, some engineers like prefer very granular, like very small tickets, and then others prefer kind of like a nebulous, like big bucket, and they sort of work through that. So, I don't know if we want to enforce one style or the other. I prefer to keep it however engineers like to work, but might be getting more aware of like how each individual likes to have their stuff broken down. That's something maybe John and I and Donald can work on.
Yeah, I don't think we should enforce anything. I'm not suggesting that. I'm like asking for how can I better support engineers and make it easier to grok what's going on and chunk things up. One of the other pieces of feedback that I received personally after I think Eric Brinkman gave this to me is he said, if it were me, what I would have done is I would have taken each of those things that a user can do and shipped them as they were done behind a feature flag and put it in the release posts. And so my inclination was like, let's wait until it's valuable, at least like the entire thing is valuable enough to use. But he said, and this is something that the Gitally team does, is like you put the small thing that's behind a feature flag in the release post as a secondary item. And then when it becomes valuable, you put it as a headline item. And that way, like the team feels like they're making progress. They get to include things in the release posts. They can get smaller MRs. It can all be behind a feature flag. So I was curious about that. And then also how we decide what feature flags to use. One of the interesting things that happened when building iterations is there was a backend feature flag, and then there was a front end feature flag that got introduced. And then you would have to turn both on. So adding that to the documentation as if like an end user was gonna like be an early adopter of that, it became more clunky. So I'm wondering if second part is like if we should consolidate like when we're building a big feature or a new thing like this to keep it behind a single feature flag, just for simplicity's sake and documentation's sake. So
I've seen these checklists pop up a little bit lately, and I don't know how they compare to like having an epic and multiple issues, but I've seen them be quite useful. I mean, sorry, to give context, like I'm thinking of, on the one hand, we have the project to move service desk to core, and that's got like a little checklist in it, and it's being done in steps. And then on the other hand, we have things like the first iteration of Jira importer, which is like an epic of epics, right? So the first iteration is a sub-epic of the main epic, and under that you've got issues, and we constantly kind of refined the issues as we went through that and threw out scope that we didn't need for the first iteration. And so I'm not sure, like I don't really know where I'm going with this. I think like for a project like the Jira first iteration of the Jira importer, where we really needed to be on top of scope constantly, we needed to be able to move stuff around and see the history of an issue like being scheduled in the first iteration, then realizing we didn't need it and putting it somewhere else, and having that was really useful. But in the case where you have something like this where it's a series of tasks and the first iteration is pretty well refined, like we know we can't release until X, maybe the task list is a better thing. Just one aside as well, maybe we should add to the issue template for features a specific heading for feature flags. We're pretty good. It's usually pretty easy now to find out which feature flag covers a specific feature, but not always. So it would be good to do that, like to have that in there.
I think it might.
I'd like to add that regarding the checklist items, so what we can start with for larger efforts that we do around feature development is that we can start with an epic with a checklist. And depending on how developers realize that which checklist item from that epic is going to take much larger effort, although both backend and front-end engineers try to keep MR size as small as possible and preferably behind feature flag so that it can still be merged into master without affecting the end product unless feature flag is turned on. So we can start with the checklist, and if we realize that a checklist item is a significant effort which requires its own discussion, then we break that item into a separate issue and just attach it to the epic. So we can start with the checklist and then move on to combining with issues and epics.
Yeah, I just the context of the reason why I'm using checklists and epics is because things in the future could change, right? And I don't want to create, like, if I see what a vision for something is and I can break it down on all these different things, A, it might not be broken down in the way that's optimal for engineers. And so, like, creating a bunch of individual issues is overhead. And B, I might not get to some of the things further down for like months. And then I don't want to have a stale issue by the time we get there. So it's like less issue management and fatigue to keep it in checklists until you are ready to work on it. And then like you can, so like for 13.2, I created issues for each of the checklist items, but I'm not going to for 13.3 because we're not there yet and it would be like wasteful. But that's how I'm personally using them. So that way we don't have issue fatigue and a bunch of stuff sitting around that may or may not ever get done.
I agree with that workflow because one, it keeps a lot of that discussion information in a single place until it's ready to be fragmented out into specific issues. And in the future, when we have epic boards, personally, like I would like my workflow as a product manager to be at the epic board level where I'm moving epics through initial thought, idea, the ideation, problem validation, solution design, and all those checklists would be things that be generated in that process. And then when we hand it to the team to discuss it and break it out, it then can evolve into an epic that has multiple sub epics and issues. And so I think we have an opportunity to just simplify the workflow from the left of the dev side once we get there by using checklists like this. I do the same thing. I think it works. Unless it doesn't, you guys let us know.
Yeah, additionally, we can also add design tab within Epic itself because for larger features, it would be a good idea to have all the designs part of Epic so that discussion can continue within the Epic instead of moving on to separate issues. And then we realize if we need a separate issue for it, we just create.
Yes, there is an issue open for that on the create team side. I'm not sure when they think they can do it. It could be one of those things that maybe we just take. But yeah, no, I agree. I'm looking forward to when we have a design tab on.
Should we maybe think about adding some handbook guidance for this, like so that we have it written down somewhere and can point to it?
No, we'll just remember, right?
I
Hardest
have
part
that.
is finding where to put it.
I have an open MR right now. Let me link it in here, talking about sort of like thinking lean. And it was the reason why, after I wrote this, that I started doing the checklist type thing. So we could add to this MR and put it in there somewhere because it's more or less where I said, like, don't create issues until the last responsible moment, more or less, because it's like just in time and it prevents a lot of waste downstream. I don't know if y'all think that that's a good spot, but I'm happy to add it there.
Sounds good to me, yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I recently worked on the Epic creation page, and that was basically a copy of the iteration page with different components. So one of the things that happened was that the scope grew tremendously because we have a blocker with the label selection and we have another one with the date selection. So I would have loved to have a checklist like that because at that moment, whenever I found that blocker, I could like close that issue because like there is a lot of work that was done and focus on those two specific items, like creating the issue afterwards. So yeah, in fact, I'm going to be adopting that if yeah, because I found that it really useful.
Cool, thanks for sharing.
Looks like we're done. Did anyone update the Zoom link at the top of the document? Because Keenan and I had a like thoroughly enjoyable call, but a completely separate call for the first 5 minutes of this one.
Yeah, I changed it.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.